This is the Food and Justice Podcast with Brenda Sanders. On this episode, I'll be speaking with Kanav Kathuria, co-founder of the Maryland Food and Prison Abolition Project, formerly the Farm to Prison Project. We'll be discussing the ways in which food is used as a tool of control in the prison system, how prison labor is used for profit in the food system, what doing work at the intersection of prison abolition and food sovereignty looks like, and much, much more. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to Food and Justice with Brenda Sanders. I am so excited about the show today. I have with us Kanav Kathuria, who is just doing some very exciting work. I want to just go through his bio a little bit before we jump into these questions. Kanav Kathuria's work lies in the intersection of abolitionism, public health, and food sovereignty. He is a 2019 Open Society Institute Baltimore Community Fellow and the co-founder of the Farm to Prison Project, a Baltimore-based organization that interrogates food conditions in carceral facilities to explore the use of food as a tool for resistance. My goodness, when I found out about this work, I was super excited, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Brenda. I'm excited for this too. Appreciate you.
So look, we got a lot of really heavy stuff to cover. I mean, this is serious stuff, and honestly, a topic that not a lot of people are talking about or even know much about. So I want to really dig into it. So I'm just going to jump right in, if that's okay with you.
Let's do it.
All right. So in a guest piece that you and Jamisha Caldwell wrote for Where Your Voice Is, Food is Political series, the piece was called Prison Food, Abolitionist Geographies and Food Sovereignty, Food as a Tool of Resistance. You wrote, eating in prison is deeply political. As opposed to providing a means of nourishment, carceral institutions weaponize and transform the role of food provision into a tool of control, dehumanization, and state-sanctioned violence. My goodness, I mean, when I read that, just a chill went through me. You know, it's like you kind of know, but you don't know. If you haven't been in there, like you really don't know. But you think you know that it must be bad because, you know, of where it is. Can you talk about some examples of ways in which food is weaponized in the prison system?
Yeah. And I think that's a good starting place too, because I think what I'm sure we'll talk about today is one, the prison food system, the experience of eating on the inside, and then kind of zooming out to contextualize how food is used as a carceral tool, both inside and outside of confinement. I think starting with prison food specifically, you know, our work lies primarily in Maryland. So that's, you know, I'll speak to our work in Maryland correctional facilities, and very much knowing that these experiences are still are replicated on a national scale in prisons and jails all across the country and in varying forms throughout the world too. But I think just to begin, you know, something to make clear is that food provision in prison can't be separated from the inherent logics of violence, exploitation, and disposability, kind of structuring prisons themselves and what gives rise to prisons as well. So we can't look at the experience of eating and its violence as separate from the overall experience of prison. So I think, you know, in our conversations with folks, and which I'll talk about our research too, and, you know, I'm sure when we talk about this again, you know, with folks, with comrades who've been on the inside, they can speak to this much better than I can too. But for now, you know, we found that food in prison kind of serves three fundamental functions. One is an everyday mechanism of control, dehumanization, and punishment. Two is a site of exploitation and profit for private food service corporations. And three, as a form of premature death due to its long-term impacts on people's physical and mental health, which we'll talk about too. And I think, you know, really focusing on that last part, right, premature death, and we'll talk about how that intersects with food apartheid too, is, you know, something we're really trying to made clear is that prison food is not defined by its capacity to nourish or to heal, but by its capacity to contribute to premature death, right? Prison creates and exacerbates long-term health conditions, diabetes, hypertension, chronic heart disease. Folks have told us they developed hepatitis B on the inside, ulcerative colitis, et cetera. And a lot of these folks didn't have these conditions before coming in, right? So prison and prison food was literally the cause of these long-term health conditions which impacts people even long after they're released, right, for the rest of their lives. So I think in just like painting a picture of the prison eating experience, there's so many different things to dive into. So I'll list out a few things and you can let me know kind of which ones to explore more. But in short, the goal of a prison, or the goal of Maryland prisons, especially after the 1970s onwards, when the state began just confining and capturing people, thousands and millions across the country, mass incarceration, the goal really is to feed as many people as possible on as low of a budget as possible, right? Which means that the prison, the per meal per person food costs in Maryland state prisons on average is about $3.83 for all 3 meals in a day.
What?
Yeah, $3.83. That's as of 2018, so that might have changed, but certainly not by much. It might have even gone lower, which comes out to what, $1.27, $1.28 per meal. And that's on average, right? There's some prisons that go down to as low as 80 cents per meal as well. So what's the type of food that can be served to someone on that budget, right? It's going to be hyper processed. It's going to be, it's going to come from a hyper industrialized preparation and storage systems too. The quantity, folks are saying it's not enough to feed a child, much less a grown person. The quality is extremely poor, not just to raw food costs, but also improper preparation and storage practices, right? For example, prisons serve food that is spoiled and rotten, like on a constant basis. For example, milk, right? Prisons, freeze, thaw, milk, fruits, other produce. And by the time it actually gets to a person, the quality that that food is, if not spoiled or rotten, just really terrible. Almost everything is canned. Everything comes out of a can. The eating environment itself is very abusive. In some prisons, people don't really choose where they sit. It's just where you are in line. You go and you sit at a certain table. In other prisons, for example, some in Baltimore, there is no like chow hall or dining hall. People are just fed through slots in their cell door, right? And like those slots themselves are filthy. When I'm talking about abuse in the eating environment, some folks, a lot of folks have told us how they're really trained to just eat as quickly as you can. You're supposed to have 20 minutes to, by the time you come in to eat your meal. In reality, you have maybe 5 or 6 and guards come around and just pick up your food and throw it in the trash. Right? You eat as quickly as you can. What does that do? You develop acid reflux. People throw up their foods. You don't eat the food. You don't taste the food. It's just a real hostile environment. And then in thinking of like nutritional value, the main component on a meal tray is starch, right? Because prisons use these cheap, abundant starches in order to fill people up in the absence of real foods. Some people have told us they eat like literally entire loaves of bread in a day to survive, because you'll get bread. That's the only thing you can really get seconds of in a lot of institutions. And then, just talking about the quality of meats as well. And we'll talk about Maryland Correctional Enterprises later, but the quality of meats is just horrendous. People have developed their own terminology for it. I can't say a lot of that on this podcast, but some of it is Rottweiler, right? People call the meat Rottweiler because it barks back at you. This isn't real food, right? Like this, like when we're talking about dehumanization, like the food that's served to people, instead of being anything that's like, emotionally, spiritually, physically nourishing, it's just an extension of the logics of prison that say, you're less than human. This like the entire eating experience itself is incredibly dehumanizing from start to finish. And I think the last thing I'll say, and we can talk about punishment and violence through prison food too, is that prisons serve this drink called base, which is like a fortified drink that's supposed to, meet the dietary and nutritional guidelines. And base, a lot of people, actually almost every single person who we spoke to was like, yeah, if you spill this substance on the floor, like it will dye the tables purple and it'll dye the floors purple. So imagine what that does besides. And previously the containers that base used to come in literally had skulls and crossbones on it, like not consumption. So yeah, that's like a overall, and I'm sure we'll get into commissary later too, and all of these other facets. But there's just a lot to explore with the Maryland correctional food system. At least that this is just an overview.
Wow, I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. That is so overwhelming just to conceptualize. That's something that's supposed to keep you alive is being used to do active harm to people is so disturbing to me. Whew. Oh my goodness. I knew it was going to be heavy. I knew.
Yeah. There's a few, I think, other points just to hit around the experience of eating. What do you think? Do we have time to go into that, or should we move on?
Absolutely. Please. Yes.
And again, this is something that, when we have round two, folks on the inside can speak to as well. But one is, since prisons have been on lock due to COVID, right? A lot of prisons, state-run prisons, if not all of them, folks are in their cells for 23 hours a day and are let out for 1 hour. And this has been going on since March or April of last year because of COVID. And one thing we've been doing is trying to track how the experience of eating and how food systems in Maryland prisons have changed as a result of COVID. And as bad as things were before, as everything I just laid out, things are getting actually even worse due to the pandemic. For instance, quality has gone even lower, quantity has gone lower. Prisons are serving a lot of bagged meals, which, like, if you think of what's in a bag, you're going to have 2 or 3 slices of bread, some meat, which people call sweaty meat, which is lunch meat, but it's literally wet. So everything in the bag tastes like that meat or smells like that meat. A carton of milk, maybe an apple. Again, the quality of that apple is very questionable. And that's lunch, right? And that's what people are being served. So when we're thinking of like the ways that food is used to punish, I think like kind of instituting lockdown even before COVID, right? Like if there was like an altercation between folks, and staff said, okay, everyone's on lock. This intrinsic form of punishment is that when prisons are on lock, people are served bagged meals a lot of the time. Which is this, like, again, insidious form of punishment. And then in terms of more overt forms of punishment, if people are caught, quote unquote, stealing food from the prison kitchen, the forms of retribution can also be quite intense, going from pat downs to strip searches, all the way to being thrown in solitary confinement. Which means that, you lose your job, the prison job, where we know the wages are quite low anyways. But then that means you have less food to buy from the prison commissary, which is like, think of it as the store on the inside. And those cycles of violence kind of, they repeat. And the forms of policing we see on the outside too are replicated on the inside, but through food, being patted down, being strip searched because you might be carrying food on you, right? Those same behaviors of like over policing and just punishment on the inside too.
I mean, the desperation that somebody must be experiencing for them to steal such a low quality of food. I mean, the food that they're already saying is terrible, but they're so desperate for food because they're not getting enough food that they're, resorting to trying to take some and then it's just a lot.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah. And,
it sounds like hell. It sounds like hell. I mean,
it's bad. And like food forms one of, I would say, the more invisibilized and constant forms of violence on the inside. Like attention is given to kind of the broader the more visible forms of just violence and brutality, such as the death penalty, solitary confinement. But I think what we're trying to see is how food forms, again, this constant, routine, invisibilized form of violence that, literally changes a person's body and mind. And if we're thinking of like violence as a continuum, or like, in terms of different levels or stages of violence, food is one of the things that is at the base. Like the death penalty, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, right? All of those are different instances of violence on the inside. That food, again, not to repeat myself, but food forms one of the constant dehumanization too.
Mm.
Food and Justice is made possible with support from Defund Big Meat, a grassroots effort to encourage strategic collaboration across all sectors of global justice. Find more information about Defund Big Meat at www.defundbigmeat.org. And A Well-Fed World, an international hunger relief and food justice organization advancing plant-based foods and farming to create a nourished and climate-friendly future. Find out more about A Well-Fed World at www.awfw.org. Thank you.
So with the Farm to Prison project, I mean, yeah, I'm really curious as to like, what is the story before the story for you? I know I didn't I wasn't intending to ask that, because I knew there was so much that we needed to cover, and I didn't want you to be hoarse from having to talk to me for so long. But how, like, what was your motivation to even start wondering about these things and start thinking about what the food situation is in Maryland prisons?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think so we started this really in 2018, so it hasn't been that long. And I think the question that was really driving us, which is kind of what led to the impetus of this work, is what is the experience of eating on the inside? And I think over the years, right, like as you said earlier, like generally we know that prison food is inhumane. We know that it's bad, right? So like the question of prison food being a form of violence, there are articles that come out, very often. There is research that's been done that speaks to how prison food constitutes a public health crisis, a human rights crisis, et cetera. Something we haven't talked about is just contamination through bugs like rodents, insects, mice, feces, in meal trays in the prison kitchen, et cetera. And there's an investigation in 2015 in Baltimore that really brought light to some of these things too. But anyways, that was kind of the initial question that led us to this work. When we're looking at food systems, institutional food systems, such as hospitals, such as schools, there's this entire, I guess, body of work and this deeper understanding that goes into, for example, the school food system, right? And all the different facets that make that system work. And I think what we saw in Maryland is that kind of understanding for corrections doesn't really exist. And just, being in community with formerly incarcerated folks, with comrades who've been on the inside talking about food, that was something that we collectively wanted to understand more deeply. So that is what kind of started the project. And, I can walk through where that took us from there. And just I think before I forget, the other thing I wanted to add is when we're talking about prison food, being, as you were saying, just really hellish, also want to point to the ways that food is used as a form of care and resistance through incarcerated folks too, shared cooking meals together, and then informal and formal forms of resistance, such as hunger strikes, refusal, which we can talk about too.
So in order to really get a real glimpse into that reality, you had to go in. You had to go inside. You had to go in and talk to people and find out. So, and you've already like given such a description of lots of stuff that is happening. And I can only guess that these are things that you found out, like you said, from folks who were formerly incarcerated, as well as folks who were on the inside. Was there more that that you could go into in terms of what came out of those discussions?
I guess I can just talk about the process a little bit,
Sure.
We spoke to folks. Our main work was obviously speaking to folks who've been on the inside or who were currently on the inside. We spoke to folks who were formerly incarcerated in prisons all across the state. And again, this work is led by people with direct experience too. Led by as in like the ways the work takes shape. So after speaking to folks on the outside, we also realized we had to engage with the state to some extent to figure out some of the things that were operating on a systematic level on the back end. So we spoke to wardens, food service managers at specific prisons, the statewide food service director, correctional staff, case managers, maintenance folks, et cetera, to kind of understand, again, how the prison food system operates from the institutional side. And then, which we'll talk about, we did dialogue circles, workshops with folks currently on the inside. And then this year, we've been speaking with formerly incarcerated folks, or folks who were just incarcerated during COVID, to understand how things have changed.
Earlier, you mentioned something, you only just touched on it, and I want to circle back around to it because I was appalled to read in the article that we were talking about that in prisons in rural Maryland, imprisoned individuals are sent to nearby farms for gleaning work. And for folks who don't know what gleaning is, it's basically picking whatever produce is left over after the mechanical harvesting. And that produce is then donated to government agencies, nonprofits, food banks, et cetera, for hunger relief. Now, there's just so much there. It's just the height of irony that this is what they are sending these incarcerated individuals out to do. I had two thoughts. My first thought was, so slavery really didn't end, right? I mean, we know from reading books and all this, like the new Jim Crow and this other articles and stuff, so this isn't a new concept that slavery never ended. But like when you see something like that, it's like, oh, there you go, like right in my state, and it was so upsetting. And my second thought was, you got hunger relief. I mean, you need hunger relief right there so how are you? Okay, so please walk me through this and just like what in the world is going on in Maryland?
Yeah, I think the contradictions you're pointing to are quite strong. I think in answering this question, there's, again, so many intersections to get into, right? First being the intersection between food systems and our carceral systems as a whole. So between corrections and between our food system, and gleaning being one form of that connection. And, we can get into other forms a little later too. And then to your point of donating to hunger relief, we also have to talk about the connections between food apartheid and prisons as well. But I think in short, answering this question kind of has to take us back to the origins and evolution of prison itself, where, prior to the 13th Amendment, so prisons began being used as these sites of punishment themselves versus kind of holding cells for people who were being, or I guess whose main punishment was corporal or capital punishment. So the role of prison changed from being a holding cell or a detention center to the main form of punishment itself. And I'm bringing that up because that coincided with, larger movements, industrial capitalism, the Enlightenment, et cetera, which was, I guess, saying that, individuals have rights, and then prisons began a way to take those prisons became a way to take those rights away. But at the time, the people who were given rights were pretty much white men. So prior to the 13th Amendment, a lot of prisons were majority white. After the 13th Amendment, prisons became a way, they became used as a way to take away rights of newly freed Black folks, right? So we saw prisons changing in terms of racial composition and function quite dramatically, with the introduction of the Black codes, et cetera, which really just criminalized the behavior and labor of previously enslaved Black folks too. As prisons began to change in composition and structure, we saw former plantations being converted into what are known today as prison farms. Right, we have Angola, Parchment Farm, many others in the South, where a lot of folks were now, who were previously enslaved, were being leased out to these plantations through convict leasing, but now under the authority of the state itself. Right, so the reason I'm saying this is because we're seeing the evolution and the connections between slavery and prison agriculture starting after the 13th Amendment. Today, these same forms of prison agriculture are abundant throughout the country. We have, Angola and Parchment in the South. We have many southern states operating these large-scale prison farms where a lot of the produce and food that's grown in the prisons are then either, sold to state agencies, or they're used to reproduce the structures of the prison itself, as in that food is then being fed back into the prison in order, to cut down costs, et cetera. So I think like when we're talking about food being donated, that's one form of violence we see in the North. In the South, it's like we have these quote unquote self-sustaining prison systems, which is so closely linked to slavery. People are being made to work the fields and farm in order to keep the prison running, right? To cut down on costs, as I was saying, so you don't have to outsource to private corporations as much as you do in other parts of the state, et cetera. In Maryland, that takes a different form, which is, as you were talking about, gleaning, right? So it's still rooted in these historic and structural forms of oppression, racialized oppression, economic oppression. We'll talk about prisons and racial capitalism too later on. But with gleaning, yeah, folks are leased out. I don't think they're paid in Maryland. It's touted as like this vocational program or this rehabilitative program. And again, all of that is just in quotations, where, folks are like, or the state is like, okay, yeah, this will help get a job after. This will help with, as they say, mitigating inmate aggression, or these really dehumanizing terms. And the same thing with the prison, the quote unquote, the prison garden in Maryland. There's a few prisons in the state that operate gardens in-house. And again, the food that's grown on there is not served back to incarcerated folks, but either taken home by correctional staff or donated again to local food banks. So again, the prison garden certainly could be a liberated zone, but what does it mean to garden or to farm or whatnot in Maryland in an environment that is designed to brutalize you and strip you of your very agency? So I think like exploring these contradictions is something we need to get deeper into as well, because we're obviously not advocating for this like self-sustaining prison as we see in the South today by any means. It's just different evolutions of these root forms of oppression and seeing how they play out in different parts of the state. And Maryland also operates different prison agricultural programs too, other than gleaning, and the prison gardens, as I mentioned, they have a baygrass program, they do some work with oysters, which I'm still trying to get greater clarity on, but prison agriculture is alive and well throughout the whole country.
And how can we justify that? How on earth can they sell that to the public? Prison agriculture? I mean, it just sounds like slavery. There's no other way to conceptualize it. I mean, and I guess that's the reason why so much of it is hidden. Wow.
Yeah, and the ones that are public, there's articles in the Washington Post that talk about this. Again, even though using the word garden is so, but the prison garden at Eastern Correctional Institute in Eastern Maryland, and the article sings their praises. Look at what these prisons are doing. Like, I think even the title of the article is like, can prison gardens like change carjackers, murderers, whatever, just this real dehumanizing language where the prison garden again is touted as this like this false rehabilitatory this false rehabilitory act that's supposed to, change these quote unquote carjackers, murder, whatever language that the state wants to use to justify prison's existence.
How surprised were you? Like the further down the rabbit hole you got, like, was there a point at which you were like, whoa, even I wasn't ready for that?
I mean, for me, this whole thing has been a learning process. So I've been surprised in different ways, right? I think, as abolitionists, we know that the links between crime and punishment are fabricated, that prisons don't keep communities safe, that they, they're used to maintain or contain the crises or can contain the crises of racial capitalism. They're used just in order to confine, cage, brutalize people with mental health issues, et cetera. I don't think, seeing prisons for anything other than what they are, that part itself, was not surprising to me. I think just kind of uncovering these deeper intersections between our food systems and our carceral systems as a whole, and just the ways, as I was saying, that those intersections are legitimized and justified by the state, that I was not expecting, right? And kind of uncovering the ways, for ourselves, for myself, that prisons and carceral food systems preclude self-determination on the outside too. And, we'll talk about the intersection between prisons and, food sovereignty as well.
Yes, I definitely want to get into that. So, one particular correctional facility in Maryland where you went, you were actually able to conduct workshops with individuals. And so I was wondering if you could tell me about those workshops and what came out of those.
Yeah, when I was saying that, our pilot was led by formerly incarcerated folks, I think this is what I was referring to, which is that to design the pilot at this facility, we went in, we held dialogue circles with about 30 folks divided into groups of 5. So we had these dialogue circles first to just understand the experience of eating on the inside at that facility. Because, as I was sharing earlier, depending on the per meal cost at the facility, its location, its classification, the experience of eating can vary based on where you are in the state, with prisons in Baltimore being by far the worst. So that was the first thing we did, hold dialogue circles. Second, we conducted, these types of design thinking workshops after the dialogue circles to kind of co-create a pilot, like what are the limitations, what are the opportunities of what we're working with. This included exercises for, I guess, re-remembering, right? Reclaiming imagination when it comes to like what food can be sourced to the institution from like a conglomerate of local farms. I remember clearly one person saying, in terms of like what foods to bring in, someone said blueberries, and another person was like, shit, I haven't had a blueberry in so long, I forgot they exist, because they're not served on the inside, and that person has been on the inside for like 15, 20 years, right? So just like recollecting itself was an act that we were focusing on. But yeah, our pilot program, things we were co-creating included, designing a new menu, designing how food should be stored, prepared, the prison eating environment, which foods to bring in when, as well as a programming component based on what folks wanted. And that program, it was an 8-week program with 2 components. The first being more around this like creative exploration of the relationship between a person and food. And then the second part being a more theoretical workshop around food and power. And why does the prison food system look the way it does? What are the connections between prisons and food apartheid and our global food system, capitalism, imperialism in our food system, and kind of diving deeper into those exercises or intersections. And the reason I say is because, of course, when COVID hit, we were unable to do any of this. Prisons went on lockdown, all programming stopped. All programming is still stopped. As I was saying earlier, folks are still in their cells. But yeah, that's what the pilot we were designing looked like.
Food and Justice is proud to be partnering with Afro Vegan Society, Thrive Baltimore Community Resource Center, My Two Foods, and Better Food Foundation.
Yeah, this is heavy stuff, but thank you so much for being willing to dive into this, because it must have been heavy on those of you who were actually in there, like engaging and finding out this information.
Yeah, I mean, it is heavy. I think for the folks of us who are doing this work who haven't been incarcerated, we're trying to use that privilege, right, to enter these spaces, which are deeply traumatic spaces, and at least help shed light. But I think again, we weren't actually enabled to enact this pilot. So I think for us, when we're talking about food as a tool of resistance, we're still figuring out the potentialities and limitations of this type of praxis, right? And I can get into why we're ultimately looking at urban farms on the outside as these sites of resistance under racial capitalism, under food apartheid, and what it means to connect urban farms to prisons. But I think, because it wasn't able to happen, there's still a lot that's left to be explored about what the limitations and forms of resistance that this practice or this praxis can uphold actually look like.
Yeah. And I mean, so many of us who are working in the nonprofit arena, community-based activism, just a lot of our programming got completely sidelined, by the pandemic. So I definitely feel your pain there. Do you think that you'll be able to circle back around to it? I mean, do you foresee that's something that will be able to happen?
I hope so. That's the goal. I think we'll have to see when prisons reopen, like what forms of programming are allowed, not allowed. There's been a lot of restructuring at DPSCS, the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, as it is. So I think, I'm just trying to be realistic, with what is possible through this work when prisons do reopen. But hopefully, of course, that the goal is to get back on the inside.
Yeah. So what does it mean to be doing work at the intersection of abolition, public health, and food sovereignty?
Yeah, that's a good question. That'll certainly take some time to answer. But I think, because our work has been, on the inside, it's been stopped due to the pandemic. What we've done on the outside is, one, I was talking about that study on food conditions during COVID, but also what we're doing is a lot of political education work around the intersections between food sovereignty and abolition. And I think we have to see these contemporary intersections in order, to see how they're interconnected, in order to kind of, contextualize prison food beyond just prison food in prisons, but also, as I was saying earlier, the ways in which food is used as a tool of control and oppression, both inside and outside of prisons, right? So if we, actually, before I get into that, I think I'll give a few examples of those connections, at least here in Maryland, and then we can kind of, talk more about that. But, first, these three examples come to mind. The first being correctional enterprises, Maryland correctional enterprises, which we can think of as like the quote unquote prison industry arm of the state. So it's part, or we can think of it for now as a part of the Division of Corrections or adjacent to it. And I'll read this quote, and this is written in the law. MCE, Maryland Correctional Enterprises, is prohibited by law from selling its products and services on the open market. Sales to state agencies in FY 2020 represented 99% of MCE's total sales, with 1% to non-state and not-for-profit agencies. So I'm saying this to say that, a lot of times when we're thinking of prison labor and we're thinking of for-profit prisons, something that's overlooked is the ways that the state itself is using prison labor for its own benefits, right? So with MCE specifically, they, again, this is a quote from their website, and they're very open about this. In FY 2019, they netted around $52.5 million in sales. And again, this is to other state agencies, and this is all through prison labor, right? The labor of incarcerated folks, where folks are being paid, anywhere from cents to dollars per day for their labor. And MCE operates multiple programs, multiple shops. Furniture, for example, they have entire furniture shops on the inside, where furniture that's made in Maryland prisons is sold to public agencies such as public universities, right? If you go to, Towson, Bowie State, any public university, they're required, again, by law, to purchase from MCE.
No.
When I was saying public agencies, to the state itself, to the state house, right? The furniture that state senators, political representatives, elected folks, the furniture that they utilized is made on the inside. Print shops, roadsides. When COVID hit, PPE was such a huge problem on the inside, as in, the invisibilization and dehumanization of incarcerated folks, that MCE started up shops in order to make personal protective equipment, hand sanitizers, gloves, masks, face shields, etc. All this is being done through incarcerated labor. And when we're talking about MCE and food, MCE operates meat processing plants, where incarcerated folks are processing meats, and those meats are then sold to the Department of Corrections and to prisons throughout the state, right? And then, as we're saying, 1% to not-for-profit agencies as well. And we know that because prisons are forced to buy from MCE, the quality of meats are even worse than, compared to the rest of, as we were saying, the horrendous food system on the inside, where, folks are saying, I don't even know if this is, chicken, beef, whatever, like it could be horse, it could be, goat, geese, it's just this like larger climate of like, what are we, like, what is this meat? What are we being served? And, MCE has a monopoly on the sales of meats for the most part to state prisons, because again, this is written in law. So that's one example, right, of a food system and carceral food systems. Another, as we've talked about, has been through gleaning and food banks and prison gardens, right, and these kind of larger intersections. And then two is, when we're talking about the prison industrial complex, the ways in which food service corporations like Aramark, like Trinity, like Crystal, Keefe Group, which operates commissary on the inside, are really using prisons and people who are held in captivity by the state as sites of exploitation when it comes to food production. So in a lot of parts of the country, food service is operated, or it's privatized, to companies like Aramark. And we saw this happening a lot after, the dismantling of the welfare state in the 1970s onward, like austerity, right? The neoliberalization of food production, where, as I was saying earlier, with, the millions of people entering confinement, the state, we're figuring out how to manage these crises to feed as many people on as low of a budget as possible. So what did they do? They privatized, they outsourced to companies like Aramark, which has been hit with hundreds of lawsuits for the ways in which they prioritize profit over actual nourishment, because, of course, right? Like that's what they exist to do. There's examples all across the country, notably in Michigan, a larger study was done too. And in Baltimore itself in 2015, Baltimore prisons, which are still operated by the state, but in 2015, they were operated by Trinity. And there was this investigation done. It was either Trinity or Crystal that was operating food service on the inside. The investigation in Baltimore found that, quote, like these are quotes that are online, the kitchens were overrun with rats, mice, roaches, feces, etc. And as a result of that, the state deprivatized and took Baltimore food service in-house. And before that, a little bit, like at that point, Baltimore was the only, county or area of Maryland where state-run prisons were privatized. Everything else was already public. So I think the things that I'm talking to you about now, about the horrendous state of food on the inside, like all of that is done. We can't only point to privatization as the root cause of that. We have to point to, carcerality itself, because these are all publicly operated prisons. So in addition to, Aramark, Trinity, Crystal, what is privatized today in all Maryland state-run prisons is commissary, right? Commissary being the prison store, where a lot of folks have told us that without commissary, they wouldn't even be able to survive, because it is in commissary that you buy foods that you're then able to eat or cook on your own, right? You're able to prepare your own foods. And, given what we've talked about today with the, just like the incredibly dehumanizing character of institutional meal service, commissary becomes this source of survival. And we know that in commissary, the prices are incredibly high, right? Like Keefe Group, again, has found this captive market just to exploit. So on the one hand, commissary is a source of survival. On the other hand, it's this, insane source of profit for privatized corporations, such as Keefe Group. And, another connection is when Maryland kicked out that private food service corporation, I believe Trinity in 2015, and when Keefe Group was introduced for commissary in 2012, the parent company of both Keefe and Trinity is HIG Capital. It's a private equity firm, right? So you can kick out one company, bring in another. It's all owned by the same people. So again, when we're talking about like the prison industrial food system or the prison industrial complex as it relates to food, there's these larger instances, with commissary, with price gouging, right? Given like the comparison of what things cost to what folks are actually paid on the inside, we're talking about, things that cost like 300-400% more than what they would on the outside. And commissary groups know that. And there's been, organizing around the country for that too. And then lastly, just a very quick example is around migrant farm workers and prison labor. I think, we know that the conditions and pay of migrant workers, a lot of whom are undocumented, are just deeply exploitative and oppressive, constituting these, quote unquote, spaces of unfreedom that exist beyond prison just being one manifestation of a space of unfreedom. And, in 2018, there's this article that's fairly popular now by Food First that outlines how under Trump, a lot of migrant workers, who again are the backbone of this country's food system, were deported. And as a result, states turned to prison labor to compensate for deportations and fill labor shortages. And then again, the facilities where undocumented folks are detained are either completely privately owned, right, subcontracted by ICE to, the Core Civic or the GEO group, or that food service in those facilities are managed by the same companies that we had mentioned earlier. So I'll pause there before we get into even more examples. But yeah, when we're talking about ultimately, food sovereignty, food systems, we have to think of food sovereignty as an abolitionist project, right? We cannot achieve food sovereignty, which I can define too, if that's helpful. We cannot achieve food sovereignty. We cannot achieve communal self-determination, Black self-determination, while prisons still stand and while all these structures of carcerality and oppression are working together, right? So we have to look at these systems as deeply interconnected because we can't reform one, right? We have to abolish them all. And that's just something I want to make really clear before moving on to.
Yeah, and if you could define food sovereignty. We do talk about food justice and food sovereignty often on the show, but for any folks who are watching who aren't quite clear about what food sovereignty is.
Yeah, so this is coming from a 2007 Global Forum on Food Sovereignty in Mali. A lot of folks use this definition, just broadly defined as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food. Food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. Really speaking to, again, the corporate controlled, or just how, when we're talking about big ag, just how deeply corporate controlled our food systems are. And I think just the last point I want to make here is that, I think we have to understand that the same underlying forms of oppression that give rise to prisons and our deeply inequitable food systems are oftentimes the same, racial capitalism and anti-Black violence, right? We know that our food systems depend on oppression to survive. And in Baltimore, looking at the connections between food apartheid and prisons, the same communities in Baltimore that are hyper incarcerated are the same ones that are denied access to fresh, nutritious, affordable foods, right? So people are cycling in between both spaces. And, we can talk about the origins of food apartheid on the outside with redlining, predatory lending, et cetera. But really looking at these two systems as interconnected. And as I was saying earlier, food being one connection between the inside and the outside too.
I want to talk just you already kind of touched on the kind of unknowns with your project and how you've had to sort of take a detour because of external circumstances. So what is next for the Farm to Prison project?
Yeah, well, as I was saying, the goal is to actually do this pilot, right? Get on the inside to mitigate the experience of eating on the inside. I think I touched on our praxis briefly, but in connecting, farms to prisons, what we're trying to do is build up communal forms of self-determination on the outside, specifically, organizations and farms working towards Black land and food sovereignty, which, Brother Eric from Black Yield Institute talks quite a bit about.
Yes.
And then on the inside, to really pave the pathway for conditions for assistance, to mitigate the experience of eating on the inside, knowing that every meal can contribute to premature death. So really trying to bridge those gaps and explore the use of food as a tool to bring the whole thing down too, and what that can look like. And then, when we're thinking of abolition in the positive sense, like how to create food systems that, as I was saying, are able to heal us, nourish us physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally too. So getting back on the inside is certainly key. On the outside, we'll be actually releasing our capstone report around, food violence in the Maryland correctional food system next month. And that's kind of, a result of all of our research we've been doing on the inside. We're releasing infographics shortly as well around food conditions in prisons due to COVID, and kind of, putting that work out there, that research out there in order to understand how things have changed and what will be permanent when prisons reopen too. And then our political education work is certainly going to be continuing too. We're currently hosting a 4-week workshop on food sovereignty and abolition. We'll continue to have different forms of political education. We're in the early stages of producing videos talking about food on the inside, the experience of eating, co-writing a zine with some other folks around food sovereignty and abolition, just really trying to contribute to this intersection as much as we can, and also just raise awareness. That's what's coming to mind for now. I'm sure there's other stuff out there too.
I'm excited. I'm very excited about your work. I am going to make sure that I am following your work. I'm already following you on Instagram. But for folks who are listening to the podcast who are as impressed and as excited about your work as I am, how can they find out more, follow what you're doing, and more importantly, get updates when, new programs and workshops and stuff are being launched? Yeah,
I'd say visit our website, farmtoprisonproject.org. We are in the middle of a name change, by the way. So we are going to be changing our name in the next month or so, but we'll have updates for that. But for now, farmtoprisonproject.org. Our IG, that's where a lot of our updates are, at MD Farm to Prison Project. Or to get involved, just hit us up at farmtoprisonproject@gmail.com. If you want to actually talk more, learn more, get involved, etc.
Yes, get involved. I have every intention of getting involved, much more so than before I knew all this. I mean, there's no way to hear all this and not feel motivated to get involved. So for folks who have tuned into this show, I know that this is a lot and it's heavy. It's much heavier for the folks who are currently suffering. So let's try to keep that in mind. And let's get involved. So I want to say thank you so much. I know how busy you must be, and I am just so honored and just elated to have had you on the show and to be able to disseminate this information and educate people about what's really going on inside Maryland prisons. Thanks so much for your expertise, for your, just your presence, your spirit here on the show, and I really look forward to having another show in which we bring on some folks who've experienced these conditions firsthand, so folks can stay tuned for that, because that is coming. So thank you so much, Kanav. I am so happy to have had you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. For real, appreciate it. Appreciate you.
All right, and thank you all for watching Food and Justice, and stay tuned for more important shows and information about our food system and the way that we can get involved to change it for the better. Thanks so much, and see you next time.
Peace.
Tune in next week for an uplifting conversation with Leanne Morissette, Communications and Culture Coordinator for the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. If you're watching on YouTube, please give the video a thumbs up and share it. Subscribe to our channel and click the bell to request all notifications. Or, if you're on Facebook, please like and share the video, like our page, and invite your friends. You can also subscribe to the show as a podcast via our website at www.fjpodcast.com. Support the show. Visit our website to find out how you can become a patron. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next week.